Okay, so Mike Nichols, staff product designer for the Workspace group in Manage. I'm here with Blair, the design manager for the Manage group. That one's hard to say. So what I want to do is go over a few options for what the Workspace experience could look like. So let me actually share my screen real quick. And I think it's important to point out, like, we're not talking about the engineering implementation so much as we are like how these could be presented to the user. So some of these might be there might be several engineering options to build things these ways. Not necessarily discussing that, more just like if it's built this way, we could still present it to the user in a couple of different ways. So I'll go through each one of these. I created an issue with several different options. I think we'll go through these one at a time. So the first one is Workspace as a top level object. So basically creating an object that sits at the top that is distinct from groups or projects, namespaces, basically, in its UI and its features. So take a quick look at what that might look like from a flow map, though these flow maps are kind of geared towards the consumption side. I'd say that there's kind of two paths that we need to look at, right? The management side of it. So if I'm an admin, what would it look like flowing between these things? These are more focused on the other side of it. If I'm consuming, so like if I'm a developer and I need to navigate between certain things, what this might look like. And I'm using issues as an example, but really it could be replaced with anything that's kind of, any kind of asset, really. So what I mean by Workspace as a separate object, so assume that namespace A is a group and namespace B is a group, and these are kind of nested. These are also, let's say this is a project over here that's not nested under this group. What I mean by as a new object, I mean not as a group, something else that sits on the top. So really, I think the important thing to take away from this is that the navigation would need to be separate from that. It's not going to be necessarily in the flow of groups. It would be a separate object that you're navigating to. So what I mean is move the admin panel capabilities to this object, allow settings to be defined and applied to all groups, subgroups, and projects from this object. So a user would set everything here and it would flow down to every other sub-object from there. You'd be able to view data, issues, members, activity, etc., across all groups, subgroups, and projects in that instance, or anything that's contained by that object. Going to the engineering side, it could include, or actually that's not engineering. It could include namespace functionality. So basically anything that we build at the namespace level, in addition to the admin things, it could also contain that as functionality. There is an existing proposal organizations. It is very similar to that. So one thing that we need to consider, though, is how this will be accessed. So right now, admins are the only ones that can see these kind of admin functionalities. And since this lives outside of the group, we need to consider how access would be granted to it. So the idea of moving things down from the admin level to, other places is to allow it to be accessible by more people, because right now only admins can see that. But just by moving this and making it a separate object, that doesn't necessarily happen for free. We would have to build some sort of access granting mechanism. And if it's outside of the groups and the project's namespace kind of access flow, it would probably need its own or somehow connect to that one. I would think that members would not inherit down into groups. And the reason for this would be preventing admins from showing up in every group. So basically, if you added someone to this group and they propagate into everything, since this is at the top, pretty much everybody would be in everything, or at least admins would be in everything. So this is what I meant earlier by the engineering side of things. It could be built as a namespace or as a separate object, I think that's really an engineering thing. So whether this is so different enough that it's easier to take a namespace and turn it into, put exceptions on it for this particular group and build it out of a namespace, or whether it's easier to just build a namespace as a separate object because there's so many exceptions, I think is largely an engineering question. So we had worked on, or are working on, really, kind of a consolidation of problem statements. So for these root cause problems, this is kind of the working list that we have. So evaluating how this would work against those problem statements. So from an engineering efficiency standpoint, it's going to depend on how it's built. For the access and permissions problems, it solves access to the instance level features, and it gives a little bit more control on permissions. Feature parity solves parity, and it improves, but it does not solve feature level availability. Hierarchy, it does not solve any of those problems. And of the navigation problems, the only one it solves is the overview. So rather than going through all of these one by one, because it'll kind of take forever, when I was saying that, I meant like there are, like under navigation, there's 4. So in this particular one, we're saying we're solving this one, but we're not solving these 3. That's what I mean by that. Some drawbacks to it, the user may want similar functionality at all other levels. It does add an additional mental model. So what I mean by that is, I think this is a good example, is if I want to find an issue and I don't know where it is, right now the user has to choose, do I want to go to the groups and search through groups and find the issue that way? Or do I want to go to the projects and find the issue that way? This would be a third one. It is a third place, since it lives outside of that kind of namespace group project hierarchy. There would be a third place that a user would have to go to. Among other things, it's another mental model thing that users are going to have to carry around. And kind of the same point, it would have to require additional navigation. Okay. So that was kind of a walkthrough. Was that clear? Do you have any questions?
Very clear, especially with the context that we already have from conversations that we've had. I like breaking out into the actual workflow. I think that that's very helpful. And for this one in particular, it really establishes 2 things. I love that you call out the mental, this is a different mental model for the user. So we will have to sort of introduce that to them. There's a definite cognitive load with that. And 2, decouples navigation. You called that out in particular. This workspaces and navigation will inherently conflict with each other.
Yeah.
But it's a problem that we don't want to get into right now at this point in time. Navigation should handle their navigation thing. Workspaces should handle their workspaces thing for the time being. And then later, once we get further down the road, we can figure out what those conflicts are or how they work together.
Yeah.
I also really like, I love the problem statements that you and Christina have been working on. And I love seeing the work that you put in of going straight raw problem statements, some not even being 100% readable, into the categories that you guys have created, and then evaluating this proposal with those problem statements, I think is a great thing. It really hones down to, helps us true back to why we're doing this, and evaluate how good of a solution or how good of a direction this is for us. Let's see here, questions that I have about this sort of thing. my questions would be user base. How are we planning to test once we boil this down, this list of 7 or 8, when we boil this down to 2 or 3 or whatever,
Mm.
what are our test paths look like for that? How are we going to gain user feedback on that? Also, what I also think would be a great addition to this with your problem statement evaluations
Mm.
would be, and I know that these are in that separate issue, but the sus verbatims that we have that sort of
Yeah.
address these things directly. I think this is great. I love this as we move forward. Also, what proposals sort of boil up to your favorite as the product designer, or like your favored direction as the product designer on Workspaces?
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I think we'll go through each one and then kind of at the end, maybe compare and contrast them. And see
Great.
where we're at with that. All right, so let me stop the recording for that.